Hello again. I'm going to be reading more Virginia Woolf short stories from this lovely collection of Virginia Woolf short stories that I love so much. Thank you, Virginia Woolf. I love you. So this short story is called Three Pictures. It is one cohesive story, but with three sections, three pictures, if you will. Yeah. Here is the first picture. It is impossible that one should not see pictures, because if my father was a blacksmith and yours was a peer of the realm, we must needs be pictures to each other. We cannot possibly break out of the frame of the picture by speaking natural words. You see me leaning against the door of the smithy with a horseshoe in my hand, and you think as you go by, how picturesque! I, seeing you sitting so much at ease in the car, almost as if you were going to bow to the populace, think, what a picture of old, luxurious, aristocratical England! We both are quite wrong in our judgments, no doubt, but that is inevitable. So now at the turn of the road I saw one of these pictures. It might have been called The Sailor's Homecoming or some such title. A fine young sailor carrying a bundle, a girl with her hand on his arm, neighbors gathering around, a cottage garden ablaze with flowers. As one passed, one read at the bottom of that picture that the sailor was back from China, and there was a fine spread waiting for him in the parlor, and he had a present for his young wife in his bundle, and she was soon going to bear him their first child. Everything was right and good and as it should be, one felt about that picture. There was something wholesome and satisfactory in the sight of such happiness. Life seemed sweeter and more enviable than before. So thinking as I passed them, filling in the picture as fully, as completely as I could, noticing the color of her dress, of his eyes, seeing the sandy cat slinking round the cottage door. For some time the picture floated in my eyes, making most things appear much brighter, warmer, and simpler than usual, and making some things appear foolish, and some things wrong, and some things right, and more full of meaning than before. At odd moments during that day and the next, the picture returned to one's mind, and one thought with envy, but with kindness, of the happy sailor and his wife. One wondered what they were doing, what they were saying now. The imagination supplied other pictures sprawling from the first one, a picture of the sailor cutting firewood, drawing water, and they talked about China. And the girl set his presents on the chimney-piece where everyone who came could see it, and she sewed at her baby clothes, and all the doors and windows were open into the garden, so that the birds were flittering and the bees humming, and Rogers, that was his name, could not say how much to his liking this was after the China seas, as he smoked his pipe with his foot in the garden. The second picture. In the middle of the night a loud cry rang through the village. Then there was a sound of something scuffling, and then dead silence. All that could be seen out of the window was the branch of a lilac tree hanging motionless and ponderous across the road. It was a hot, still night. There was no moon. The cry made everything seem ominous. Who had cried? Why had she cried? It was a woman's voice, made by some extremity of feeling almost sexless, almost expressionless. It was as if human nature had cried out against some iniquity, some inexpressible horror. There was dead silence. The stars shone perfectly steadily. The fields lay still. The trees were motionless. It all seemed guilty, convicted, ominous. One felt that something ought to be done. Some light ought to appear tossing, moving agitatedly. Someone ought to come running down the road. There should be lights in the cottage windows, and then perhaps another cry, but less sexless, less wordless, comforted, appeased. But no light came. No feet were heard. There was no second cry. The first had been swallowed up, and there was a dead silence. One lay in the dark listening intently. It had been merely a voice. There was nothing to connect it with. No picture of any sort came to interpret it, to make it intelligible to the mind. But as the dark arose at last, all one saw was an obscure human form, almost without shape, raising a gigantic arm in vain against some overwhelming iniquity. The third picture. The fine weather remained unbroken. Had it not been for that single cry in the night, one would have felt that the earth had been put into harbor, that life had ceased to drive before the wind, that it had reached some quiet cove, and there lay anchored, hardly moving on the quiet waters. But the sound persisted. Wherever one went, it might be for a long walk up into the hills, something seemed to turn uneasily beneath the surface, making the peace, the stability all round one seem a little unreal. There were the sheep clustered on the side of the hill. The valley broke in long tapering waves like the fall of smooth waters. One came on solitary farmhouses. The puppy rolled in the yard. The butterflies gamboled over the gorse. All was quiet, as safe as could be. Yet one kept thinking. A cry had rent it. All this beauty had been an accomplice that night, had consented to remain calm, to be still beautiful. At any moment it might be sundered again. This goodness, this safety, were only on the surface. And then to cheer oneself out of this apprehensive mood, one turned to the picture of the sailor's homecoming. One saw it all over again, producing various little details. The blue color of her dress, the shadow that fell from the yellow flowering tree. That one had not been used before. So they had stood at the cottage door, he with his bundle on his back, she just lightly touching his sleeve with her hand, and a sandy cat had slunk round the door. Thus, gradually going over the picture in every detail, one persuaded oneself by degrees that it was far more likely that this calm and content and goodwill lay beneath the surface, more than anything treacherous, sinister. The sheep grazing, the waves of the valley, the farmhouse, the puppy, the dancing butterflies were in fact like that all through. And so one turned back home, with one's mind fixed on the sailor and his wife, making up picture after picture of them, so that one picture after another of happiness and satisfaction might be laid over that unrest, that hideous cry, until it was crushed and silenced by their pressure out of existence. Here at last was the village, and the churchyard through which one must pass, and the usual thought came as one entered it, of the peacefulness of the place, with its shady yews, its rubbed tombstones, its nameless graves. Death is cheerful here, one felt. Indeed, look at that picture. A man was digging a grave, and children were picnicking at the side of it while he worked. As the shovels of yellow earth were thrown up, the children were sprawling about, eating bread and jam and drinking milk out of large mugs. The gravedigger's wife, a fat, fair woman, had propped herself against a tombstone and spread her apron on the grass by the open grave to serve as a tea table. Some lumps of clay had fallen among the tea things. Who was going to be buried, I asked. Had old Mr. Dodson died at last? Oh, no. It's for young Rogers, the sailor, the woman answered, staring at me. He died 2 nights ago, of some foreign fever. Didn't you hear his wife? She rushed into the road and cried out, Here, Tommy, you're all covered with earth. What a picture it made. Rest in peace, Roger. Rest in peace.